The strangest thing in this photograph is not what you can see. It is the distance from which you are being allowed to see it. A small clearing interrupts the forest. A few simple communal structures sit inside it. There are no roads leading in, no modern infrastructure around it, no visible route connecting this settlement to the outside world, and the camera never comes closer. I kept returning to that detail. This was not a place nobody could find. The people protecting this territory knew where it was well enough to photograph it from above. The decision was not to avoid locating the settlement. The decision was to avoid walking into it. So this photograph is not evidence of a place the modern world cannot reach. The official explanation is straightforward. Brazil now protects isolated indigenous peoples without assuming that protection requires contact. Aerial surveillance and territorial monitoring can document their presence while reducing unnecessary intrusion. But that leaves a harder question, because Brazil did not always stay away. For much of the 20th century, isolated groups were approached, contacted, settled, or drawn into relations with the outside world. And some of those encounters ended with epidemics, violence, population collapse, and the destruction of entire groups. The photograph may be evidence of something more unsettling, a place history taught the modern world not to enter. And there is a remarkably simple way to test when that lesson was learned. It is a map. Printed in 1914, the map shows the approximate route of the Roosevelt-Rondon expedition through remote Brazilian territory. Its subject is a tributary of the Madeira River that the expedition had surveyed through a region still imperfectly mapped by outsiders. The route is not vague. It represents movement through the interior. Men traveled there. They established camps. They followed the river. They recorded tributaries, portages, and topography. The expedition included Cândido Rondon, one of the most important figures in Brazil's expansion into its interior, and Theodore Roosevelt, the former president of the United States, and they were doing this in 1913 and 1914. That single object quietly destroys the literal premise that some great Amazonian prohibition began in 1900. 14 years after that date, outsiders were not merely entering remote Brazil. They were surveying it. The surviving photographs make the contradiction even harder to avoid. Expedition members appear physically inside the landscape the map records. Boats, equipment, camps, riverbanks, human movement. Whatever happened later, this was not yet a policy of deliberate distance. In fact, the map points toward almost the opposite philosophy. Rondon's work belonged to a much larger state project. Telegraph lines were being pushed into the Brazilian interior. Expeditions carried survey equipment, communications infrastructure, administrative authority, and the expanding physical presence of the state. The forest was not being treated as a space from which the state should withdraw. It was being connected, mapped, measured, entered, and indigenous peoples were part of that expansion. In 1910, Brazil created the Serviço de Proteção aos Índios, the SPY, the federal agency that would dominate state relations with indigenous populations for more than half a century. Rondon became central to its early history. The important detail is not simply that the agency existed, it is the assumption beneath it. Early 20th century policy did not normally begin from the principle that an isolated people had a right to remain beyond ordinary contact. Government policy could involve attraction, contact, tutelage, settlement, and eventual incorporation into the larger national society. Protection and contact were not yet seen as opposites. Very often, contact was understood as part of protection. That makes the aerial photograph we began with difficult to explain, because the state represented by that photograph is behaving according to a different logic. It identifies a settlement and does not automatically approach it. It watches the territory while attempting to reduce intrusion. Somewhere between the expedition map and the aerial photograph, the meaning of protection changed. The archive of the Comissão Rondon helps show just how large that change was. Its surviving photographs and films preserve telegraph projects, camps, equipment, expeditions, encounters, and the physical machinery of penetration into the interior. These images belong to a period when reaching distant territory was itself an accomplishment of government. A line on a map meant expansion. A telegraph station meant connection. An expedition photograph meant that another part of the interior had been brought within a wider system of state knowledge. But once the SPI system is followed deeper into the 20th century, a different body of evidence begins to appear. In 1967, a government inquiry produced what became known as the Relatório Figueiredo. The surviving dossier is enormous, thousands of pages. Administrative records gathered through an investigation of the SPI system. And inside that documentary mass are records of serious abuses and violations involving indigenous communities. The importance of this evidence is easy to exaggerate in the wrong direction. The report did not, by itself, create the modern no-contact policy. The later reversal cannot be reduced to one investigation or one scandal, but the report does something more fundamental. It makes it impossible to tell the history of state contact as a simple story of protection advancing into an untouched interior. The institutional record had become much more troubling. By 1967, the SPI was abolished. Funai, the Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, replaced it. At first glance, that looks like the turning point. An old institution ends. A new one begins. It would be tempting to place the modern policy there, but another document prevents us from doing that. The Indian Statute of 1973 was enacted 6 years after Funai's creation, and it still contemplated the progressive integration of indigenous peoples into the broader national community. That date matters, because it tells us that changing the institution did not immediately change the governing philosophy. The state could abolish the SPY and still preserve the assumption that integration remained an eventual objective. So the photograph from the beginning is not simply the product of 1967. The decisive break came later. Funai identifies 1987 as the critical point. That year, policy toward isolated indigenous peoples changed in a fundamental way. The older logic had generally assumed that protection could require approaching isolated populations. The emerging policy rejected that assumption. Contact would no longer be treated as the automatic objective. Isolation could itself be respected. Territory could be protected without requiring the people inside it to enter ordinary relations with the state or surrounding society. This does not mean every isolated group had the same history. It does not mean isolation always resulted from a single, freely chosen decision made without outside pressure. Some groups had histories shaped by violence, disease, invasion, displacement, or previous encounters. What changed was the state's default position. The burden shifted. Instead of asking how to reach an isolated population, authorities increasingly had to ask whether reaching them was necessary at all. 1 year later, another document widened the change. Brazil's 1988 Constitution recognized indigenous social organization, customs, languages, beliefs, traditions, and original rights over traditionally occupied lands. This was not merely an administrative adjustment to contact procedures. The constitutional framework itself was changing, and once indigenous cultural continuity and territorial rights were treated differently, remaining isolated could no longer be understood simply as a temporary condition waiting to be corrected through integration. But even then, the legal machinery behind the modern restricted territories was still developing. In 1996, Decree 1775 provided authority for the Federal Indigenous Agency to regulate third-party ingress and transit in areas where isolated indigenous peoples had been identified. Now, the new principle could take physical form on the map, not a prohibition covering the Amazon, not a line drawn around some mythical center of the rainforest, a defined area, a specific territory, a legal mechanism controlling who could enter it. That distinction explains much of the confusion surrounding places like the settlement in the photograph. The forest itself is not forbidden. A protected indigenous territory can be subject to restricted access, and even there, the rule is not that no human being may ever cross its boundary. Indigenous residents live there. Government protection teams may operate there. Authorized activity can occur under regulated conditions. Emergency contact can occur, and illegal intruders sometimes enter despite the law. The modern system is not an invisible wall, it is controlled access. The clearest expression of the philosophy behind that control came in April 2000. Funai's Portaria, 281 formalized principles that would have been difficult to reconcile with the older contact model. The existence of an isolated population did not automatically create an obligation to contact it. Its territory and natural resources were to be protected. Its ability to continue traditional activities was to be respected. Its health vulnerability required particular attention. Economic and commercial activity inside the areas it inhabited was prohibited. The document replaced an earlier 1987 regulation. That gives us something the opening photograph cannot provide on its own: a timeline. The camera remains distant not because of a mysterious order issued in 1900. The documented policy behind that distance belongs principally to the end of the 20th century, and now the 1914 map begins to mean something different. At first, it merely disproved the date. Now, it marks one side of a historical reversal. The expedition route shows a state and scientific culture moving inward. The later Funai framework shows an institution establishing circumstances in which movement inward should stop. The question is, what made that reversal seem necessary? Part of the answer lies in territory. Contact is rarely just a meeting between two groups of people. It can open routes. Routes can bring settlers, workers, commercial interests, missionaries, prospectors, loggers, fishers, miners, and disease. Once contact occurs, the relationship is difficult to contain within the moment of first encounter. A settlement that becomes known outside a protected system can become exposed to pressures far larger than the people living inside it. And then there is health. Populations living with limited exposure to diseases circulating widely outside their territory can face exceptional risks when sustained contact begins. Historical and medical evidence has documented severe epidemic vulnerability in some isolated and recently contacted populations. That does not mean every contact event produces the same result. It means contact can carry consequences that cannot be reversed once the encounter has occurred. From that perspective, distance becomes more than a cultural principle. It becomes a precaution, and few places make that principle more visible than Vale do Javari. The terra indígena, Vale do Javari, lies in western Amazonas. It covers approximately 8.54 million hectares. It is one of Brazil's largest indigenous territories and contains an exceptional concentration of peoples living in isolation, alongside indigenous peoples with different histories of contact. On a conventional map, a territory of that size can appear as a vast region of forest. From the air, much of it may seem almost empty, but this is where the opening photograph becomes useful again. A clearing interrupts the canopy. Structures appear. Human presence becomes visible. What looked empty was inhabited, and the absence of roads or modern infrastructure no longer means the territory has been forgotten. It may mean precisely the opposite. Somebody is actively trying to prevent the surrounding infrastructure from reaching the people inside it. Vale do Javari also destroys another easy misconception. Its modern legal protection did not begin in 1900. Territorial studies were published in the late 20th century. Presidential homologation came in 2001. The protection visible today is the result of comparatively recent legal and institutional development. And even within Vale do Javari, no contact does not mean that contact has become impossible under every every circumstance. A Karubo group was contacted by Funai in 1996 under exceptional conditions amid violent pressure in the region. Further contact events occurred later. That history matters because it defines the policy more accurately. No contact is not a claim that every isolated people must remain untouched regardless of circumstance. It is a rejection of contact as the automatic default. The difference is subtle, but historically it is enormous. A century earlier, entering could be treated as evidence of progress. Now, under particular conditions, choosing not to enter can be treated as the more responsible action. The same logic appears outside Vale do Javari. Massaco, in Rondonia, became an important example of territorial protection designed specifically around an isolated population. Monitoring continued without ordinary contact. In Ituna Itata, restriction measures have been used to prohibit unauthorized entry, residence, and movement across a defined area because of evidence associated with isolated indigenous presence. Memoria Grande provides another contemporary example of the same principle being applied through restriction measures. The point is not that all of these territories have identical legal histories. They do not. The pattern is that modern protection is territorial, specific, and administrative. Different boundaries, different evidence, different legal instruments, but the same underlying principle can appear repeatedly. Presence does not automatically require approach. That principle changes how modern aerial monitoring should be understood. An aircraft sees a clearing. A satellite image reveals changes in vegetation. A field team encounters traces near the edge of a protected area. Protection bases monitor movement through river systems and access routes. Information accumulates, but the investigation can stop before the village itself is entered. This creates an unusual kind of government knowledge. Authorities may know enough to say that people are there without claiming to know everything about them. They may know where territorial pressure is occurring without turning every settlement into a destination for direct observation. They may confirm presence while deliberately preserving uncertainty. That restraint is not evidence of ignorance. It is part of the method, but it creates a harder practical problem. A territory cannot be protected simply by declaring it protected. Illegal entry still happens. Mining, fishing, logging, and other incursions can cross legal boundaries. Protection teams and law enforcement operations may therefore have to enter the wider territory precisely because other outsiders are trying to enter it for reasons the law prohibits. This is the paradox at the center of modern no-contact policy. To leave one population alone, other people may have to remain constantly present around them. Monitoring is necessary. Enforcement is necessary. Territorial information is necessary. Occasionally, intervention may be necessary. The objective is not total absence. It is controlled distance, and that makes the boundary far more fragile than the word forbidden suggests. A line on an official map does not physically stop a miner. A restriction order does not make a river impassable. A protection base does not remove every economic incentive pushing toward indigenous territory. Entry can be illegal without being impossible. The modern system therefore depends on something more difficult than closure. It depends on continuing enforcement. That may be the strongest unresolved part of this history. The state has developed a legal doctrine explaining why some people should remain uncontacted. But protecting that choice requires institutions operating inside the same economic and political world that produces pressure to enter. The history has moved from one contradiction to another. First, the state pushed deeper into the interior while presenting contact as protection. Now, the state sometimes has to project authority into the interior in order to prevent unwanted contact. The instruments changed. The direction changed. But the territory never stopped being contested. And Brazil is not the only country confronting this problem. Across the border, Peru developed its own legal framework for indigenous peoples living in isolation or in initial contact. Reserves were established for populations facing many of the same dangers: territorial invasion, disease exposure, unwanted encounters, and pressure from outside economic activity. At the inter-American level, the principle of respecting peoples who remain in isolation has also been connected to the protection of life, health, territory, and cultural integrity. That comparison matters because it removes one final layer of false mystery. Brazil's restricted territories are not the remains of some unique secret closure. They are part of a wider legal and ethical response to a problem that crosses national borders. How should modern states behave toward populations that have strong reasons not to participate in ordinary contact with surrounding society? For much of the 20th century, the answer often leaned toward intervention. Approach them, establish relations, administer, settle, integrate. By the end of the century, a different answer had become possible. Protect the land. Monitor the threats. Do not assume that recognition creates a right to intrude. The transformation was not immediate. That is one of the clearest lessons in the documentary record. The SPI ended in 1967, yet integrationist language remained visible in federal law in 1973. The decisive policy change is associated with 1987. The constitutional framework changed in 1988. Specific authority to regulate access followed in the 1990s. The principle that confirmation did not automatically require contact was clearly codified in 2000. This was not one moment of sudden enlightenment. It was a gradual reversal. Institutional failure mattered. Changing ideas about indigenous rights mattered. Territorial protection mattered. The accumulated consequences of violent and destructive encounters mattered. Health vulnerability mattered. And no single surviving document proves that one factor alone caused the change. The evidence supports a convergence, a contact system developed over decades. Its limits became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then, another system emerged in which restraint itself could become an administrative objective, which brings us back to the 1914 map. When we first looked at it, its meaning seemed obvious. It proved that the title could not be literally true. Remote Amazonia was being entered after 1900, but the longer the investigation continues, the more important that map becomes. It is not merely evidence against a date. It records an older relationship between the Brazilian state and the interior. The line across the page represents movement toward places that state institutions wanted to know, connect, survey, and incorporate into wider systems. Now, return to the aerial photograph. It records another kind of state relationship. The territory is still being observed. Information is still being gathered. The settlement is still present within a system of maps, aircraft, legal boundaries, administrative records, and protection operations. The state has not vanished from the landscape. What has changed is the final step. The expedition once continued toward the people it encountered. The aircraft turns away. That distance is the result of a century in which the meaning of contact itself changed, and it still does not resolve every question. We cannot reduce the 1987 reversal to one report, one epidemic, one institution, or one moral realization. We cannot assume that every isolated population has the same reasons for remaining apart. We cannot pretend that legal protection has ended illegal intrusion, and we cannot protect isolated peoples without confronting the difficult question of how much observation and enforcement can occur before protection itself becomes another form of unwanted presence. But we can answer the question that began with the photograph. No prohibition sealed the heart of the Amazon in 1900. For decades after 1900, Brazil continued pushing into the interior, mapping territory, building infrastructure, administering indigenous affairs, and pursuing forms of contact and integration. The restrictions that exist today belong to a much later history. They emerged as the state increasingly recognized that indigenous territory, cultural continuity, health, and autonomy could sometimes be protected only by abandoning the assumption that every population had to be approached. So, the apparent emptiness around that clearing is misleading. The territory is not inaccessible. It is not forgotten. It is not beyond the reach of maps or aircraft. and it is not evidence of something being hidden from the outside world. It is an inhabited homeland inside a legal system that, after generations of entering, eventually developed a reason to stop. That is what changed, not the ability to reach the settlement, the belief that reaching it was always the right thing to do,